Welcome to this week's episode of Bouncing Back Stronger. Before we start, you know the drill. Make sure that you like, subscribe, turn the notifications bell on, and enjoy the clip. It's called Bouncing Back Stronger. So Eliza, you got in touch with me and you said you'd like to, come onto the podcast and talk about primarily really the psychedelics. I mean, you are also a burnout recovery specialist and you are also a doctor of acupuncture, but it's the psychedelics, isn't it? That's really something, an area that you have been working on and focusing on.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
something that I became passionate about as an extension of those things that I did because the bulk of the work that I do is acupuncture and burnout recovery with people. And that's because I became an acupuncturist as a result of kind of not wanting to go into the biomedical system
Mm-hmm.
because I was pre-med. And I became a burnout specialist because I burnt out myself in the process of being an entrepreneur and building a business and having patterns of childhood trauma and, growth and things like that impact my adult life. So that's how I got into both of those. And I did a lot of work on myself over the course of 20 years in therapy,
Mm-hmm.
did my burnout recovery, did, functional medicine and the physical element of recovery I've been working on for a few years. And I felt like I was just kind of stuck.
Mm.
So I had learned all of these amazing somatic techniques like breathing techniques and yoga nidra and all of these types of things that are
Mm.
supposed to help bring our parasympathetic nervous system online and calm our sympathetic nervous system and bring us out of fight or flight. And I knew all of them and I would do them and it would feel like they weren't very effective. And so I got to a point in my life where I don't have panic attacks often or anxiety attacks, but I would have an anxiety attack and I could tell you in the middle of the anxiety attack what was biologically and biochemically happening in my body,
Mm.
but I couldn't get myself to really fully calm down and come back to ground very well. So I had a very, very high, a very low threshold for stress, and I would hit that threshold very quickly. And I work with veterans, the United States military in my acupuncture practice, and some of them had utilized psychedelics for post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I started understanding more about my life and my past, I realized that I had complex PTSD
Okay.
from my childhood trauma, which was my mother passing away when I was a baby.
Oh, okay.
So that's what we refer to as pre-verbal trauma. And so I didn't have words and emotions, at the time to express my emotions because I
Oh.
was 13 months old. And so that stayed in my body and that's what I had been trying to deal with and couldn't. So I decided to find a coach and utilize psychedelic mushrooms as the next step in my journey. And after doing that for the first time in my life, I could feel my body. I felt embodied. I could feel the way emotions interact in my body and I could interact with them in a new way. And so it created a brain body somatic connection that had literally been severed in
Yeah.
me as a result of my history and my trauma.
So, Eliza, just for the audience, really, what is a psychedelic?
That's a great question. So there are several different types of compounds that
Mm.
are considered psychedelics. So there are plant medicines like mushrooms, and
Mm-hmm.
well, mushrooms aren't plants, they're fungi. I get so specific about that, but they get kind of lumped into plant medicines.
Yeah.
There are different types of plant medicines like ayahuasca. There are sort of chemically produced compounds like LSD and MDMA, which is ecstasy.
Right.
And a hallucinogen is something that acts on your body and your brain at certain receptors, usually serotonin receptors in the case of most of these, certainly with mushrooms, which is what I specialize in. So,
Right.
LSD, MDMA, that type of stuff, those are all psychedelics. Those are not my area of specialty, but they act on your brain in a way that helps different parts of your brain that wouldn't normally be able to talk to one another to
Okay.
actually start talking. So when we take higher doses of these things, this is what people refer to as tripping. And that's why sometimes people say that they can taste colors or they can see music because the parts of the brain that deal with taste and vision and sound communicate in a way that they normally don't when you are not on a psychedelic.
Okay. So, um,
If they're not, if your parts of your brain are not communicating, what does that mean for that particular individual?
It depends. So, like, normally on day-to-day function, we don't want the visual and the auditory cortex to communicate that way because we wouldn't be able to walk through life.
Yeah, you'd be overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. But when we have trauma, when we have challenges, when we have stress, when we have anxiety, different parts of our brain not being able to connect makes it harder for us to be able to regulate our state and regulate our emotions. And being a burnout specialist, one of the things that happens in burnout is our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for our executive function. So, our decision making, our ability to focus, our inhibitory behaviors. So, this is why these things are important when it comes to addiction.
yeah.
That part of the brain shrinks and the connections break down. So
Wow.
being able to utilize a psychedelic under a safe and supported environment can help some of those connections reestablish,
Hmm.
and that effect can last after the psychedelic is out of your system. And so that's why we do what we call integration work. So if somebody takes a microdose or a large dose, you still want to work with a specialist, or a guide or a coach afterward to process what's happening to be
Yeah.
able to help solidify those connections. Because in the brain, there's something called Hebb's law, which is neurons that fire together wire together. So the more we think about something, the more we do something, the more that cements in our brain. So when we're learning a language or an instrument, that's why we practice. But when we also have negative thoughts about ourselves, like I'm not good enough,
Uh-huh.
or we have imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
or we think the worst of a situation, that's also going to create that strong neural connection.
So even perhaps we've got constructive things that
Mhm.
our brain can do, and then we've got this we have the destructive side, and I'm namely probably thinking addiction here as well, because if you keep doing something, that's over and over again, then that's where obviously the problems arise.
I mean, addiction, but psychedelics have also been used to treat things like OCD. So
OCD. Yeah.
OCD is almost a type of addiction,
Uh-huh.
but it's something that people do for a sense of security and a sense of safety. And that is often what people who are addicted to substances do as well,
Yeah.
is because it puts us in a state, it changes our neurochemistry temporarily to
Yeah.
make us feel like we have control over something, even if we don't,
Yeah.
or it gives us a sense of safety. We're always looking for a sense of safety and secure attachment. And if we
Yeah.
can't get that from our relationship, sometimes we look to substances.
Yeah, absolutely. So, who else can it help, Eliza? So, it can help people with addiction. It can help people with OCD. Um, yeah. What other areas would it help? Would using
The areas
psychedelics help?
Yeah, the areas that have largely been studied have been PTSD and treatment resistant anxiety and depression.
Great.
So for people who have, gone through large trauma, big T trauma, like I had losing a
Uh-huh.
parent at a pre-verbal age, or little T trauma, which is just having a parent who isn't present or who is, the daily criticism that comes along with that type of sort of smaller but incredibly impactful abuse.
That's really
So
interesting, actually, because I think even our listeners, they might say, "Well, I've had no trauma in my life," because we always assume that trauma has to be,
right.
I guess really big, something that is absolutely, horrifying. But we
Yeah.
can all have small traumas as well, can't we?
Yeah,
As you're
absolutely.
describing.
And that type of thing can happen even when the people in our lives have the best of intentions.
Mm,
So if someone is a single parent, a single mom or a single dad, and they have to work two or three jobs to be able to support their family, that means they're less present.
yeah.
And so one of their kids, perhaps the oldest kid, may take on the responsibility of the family and then feel like they have to hide their emotions so that they don't overwhelm their parent. So the parent isn't abusing them in any way, shape, or
Uh-huh.
form. They're doing the best that they can, but that still isn't necessarily a secure attachment. And that, to me, is a reflection of a larger societal problem that we have,
Yeah.
that I unfortunately can't fix in one fell swoop. But that is the type of thing that we would consider little t trauma if it impacts somebody later in life in a way that gives them unhealthy coping mechanisms, or
Mm,
that makes them take responsibility for the emotions of the people around them, or hide what they're feeling and avoid expressing themselves in
Mm.
a healthy and meaningful way that can create connection. So yeah, there's definitely big T trauma and little T trauma. Um,
So
but
can
one of
you
the
tell?
populations, oh,
Sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say,
Um,
could you tell us exactly how it works? I know you mentioned it before, but can you tell us exactly how does it work? You know, I come to you, for example, I'm suffering from severe depression. You know, I've tried my antidepressants, or
mhm,
yeah, I've tried my antidepressants. I didn't feel really any better with them, maybe slightly, but perhaps not so noticeable.
mhm.
Um, and maybe almost, would you say, like, using a psychedelic, perhaps in this culture at the moment, would be my last resort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when people with things like PTSD or complex PTSD or treatment resistant anxiety, depression come to
Uh-huh.
me, I usually refer them out to treatment resistant therapists or psychedelic assisted therapy. So my specialty is actually when you had asked about like the populations of people that this can help. My specialty is with people who have day-to-day stress and anxiety and burnout, and they can manage it, but they're really feeling burdened by all of it. So it's not
Yeah.
something that's, keeping them in bed. It's not something that's preventing them from being able to
But
connect
perhaps
with
it is
people.
more of a preventative measure. So before they get to that stage,
Yeah.
before it goes too far, before it goes to that stage where they can't get out of bed in the morning, it's
Yeah.
like, actually, I need some help. I'm going downwards in a spiral, and they come to you. And that's
Yep.
where you bring in the psychedelics.
Yeah, and I use
Yeah.
it in a microdosing sense. So, a lot of the research that's been done in things like treatment resistant anxiety and depression, PTSD, addiction, most recently anorexia nervosa, those tend to be large dose circumstances.
So
That's what
what's the
those
difference?
research
Could you
conditions.
explain to us what's microdosing?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, these larger doses tend to be anywhere from like 1 to maybe at the max 5 grams. It depends on the research study. That type of dose is going to get you what we think of as a traditional trip. So that is going to be seeing patterns, seeing fractals, walls looking like they're breathing. I saw something recently on social media. Somebody in Amsterdam went and got legal, like mushroom truffles or something, truffle
Hmm.
infused chocolate, something like that, and went to the Van Gogh Museum because the Van Gogh painted that style of painting looks really neat
Hmm.
when you're on mushrooms. So those types of things may happen, but you're also going to get the bigger emotional experiences. So the breaking down of the sense of self, feeling like you're one with the universe. Sometimes the anxiety that comes with that, it can be really anxiety producing. With microdosing, you're taking an incredibly small dose. So you're taking a fraction of this. And microdoses usually start at zero point 0.1 grams.
Oh, wow.
So very, very small.
Yeah.
And they usually don't go higher than 0.25 to zero point 0.3. So that would be 100 milligrams to 250 milligrams about. And so with that, we're not getting the visual hallucinations. We're not getting those feelings of euphoria. We're getting just enough in the system to be able to think a little bit differently and create changes in our mindset, in our coping mechanisms, and things like that. But we can still function in day to day life.
Mm-hmm.
So people that I know, don't have like medical licenses or things like that, but like who work a desk job or who work online, they may microdose a couple of times a week and do that work intentionally. So a microdose is a very, very small dose. And should actually take you through sort of the range of doses. Microdose is that very small dose where you tend to not feel effects. A mini dose is a little bit more than that, maybe zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.5, where you might start to feel some of that warm, fuzzy euphoria. A museum dose is about what we talked about taking
Yeah.
in Amsterdam. So it's usually still, and this is also, these are estimates based on people's tolerance. So somebody can take a gram
You
and
said
that's a museum dose.
a microdose, you wouldn't feel any effects. So
Mhm.
how would that be beneficial?
Because the compound is still working in your brain,
Right.
even though you're not necessarily feeling the effect.
Right. Okay.
So that the sort of border of that between a microdose and a mini dose, I usually describe as feeling like you've had a half a glass of wine on an empty stomach. You're
Right.
not dysfunctional, you everything looks normal, but something's in your system. Something's a little bit different. So that's kind of that border that we're looking to stay under
Yeah. I
with
see.
microdosing.
And you know, yeah, I think you mentioned something earlier, but I'll ask you now. If you're if you're taking psychedelics, would you always take them, say, with yourself or with a therapist, or would you take them at home? You know, what does it look like? How does that work?
That depends on the landscape of where you live and the legalities. So
Okay,
I know in the UK it's still illegal.
it
In the
is, yeah.
US, federally, so across the United States, the US government, the federal government considers it illegal. Various states and municipalities, like cities and townships, are legalizing or decriminalizing it. They have the authority to do that. And so that means that like the police won't really look into it. They won't make it a priority.
Yeah.
Um, in certain places like Colorado, you can legally have a certain amount in your possession, and that's okay. And you can do that
Ah,
recreationally, you can do it therapeutically. So it really just depends.
okay.
For somebody who's never done it, I highly recommend doing it with a specialist, whether you're microdosing or macrodosing.
Yeah.
And if you're going to acquire it, you need to be mindful of if it's legal in your area.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
people who still do it,
Yeah.
but you're taking a different risk
I'll go to
when you do.
Amsterdam.
Yeah, or go to Amsterdam, yes.
But I was
Someplace where it's
listening to you.
decriminalized or legalized. If you're gonna be doing a large dose,
Yeah.
I highly recommend, at the very least, having what's called a trip sitter, which is somebody who can help support you through the process if you need to get up and go to the bathroom, if you want the lighting changed or the sound, or you're struggling emotionally and you want somebody to hold your hand,
Uh-huh.
somebody who's at least a bit familiar with that process to sit with you and do it. And if you're going to be working on bigger issues like anxiety, OCD, PTSD, things like
PTSD.
that, it's my personal feeling that you should be working with a specialist. That is not something that you should be working with on your own,
Yeah.
because when we take these compounds, like we said, it acts on the brain and it creates this window of neuroplasticity, this window of flexibility that persists in the days and weeks after you take a psychedelic. And that's kind of where the magic of magic mushrooms lies, as I always say.
Mm.
And being able to process those feelings with somebody else who can help you do that
Mm-hmm.
tends to make that work more effective, and it makes it stick. That's where the good results come from. Is not just that you're taking a compound and feeling better, it's that you're taking a compound that affects your brain in a way that makes it easier and more effective to do the type of work that you would do in therapy or coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. You need that support, I think, you know, to process and to reflect perhaps on, you know, what's just happened. How did you feel? How do you feel
Precisely.
now? How do you feel afterwards? You know, so what's the law like where you are right now?
In Rhode Island, in the state where I'm in, we're hopefully in the process of decriminalizing it.
Yeah.
So legislation came through. We have two different chambers, like the federal government does. We have a House of Representatives and we have a Senate. And a bill passed in the Senate to decriminalize it, which would mean that you could legally possess up to an ounce of psilocybin, and that you could grow it and cultivate it for
And
your own personal
psilocybin
use.
is the main compound, isn't it, within the
It's the main
mushroom?
compound in magic
Yeah,
mushrooms, yes.
yeah.
So you would be able to cultivate it. I think there was also a thing where you could gift it, so you couldn't sell it, but you could give a certain amount to someone that you know. And that legislation now has to get through the Senate, which we're hoping happens next year. So hopefully within the next 12 months, it will be decriminalized here.
Wow.
Um, in other areas locally, in Massachusetts, which is one of our neighboring states,
Hmm.
several townships have decriminalized it. Washington, D.C. has decriminalized it. Colorado, I think, has legalized it. Oregon has legalized it for medical use.
So perhaps
And
that's
so
all
it depends on the
positive, you
state.
know, if lots of states have already started, well, we say here, get the ball rolling, then,
Yeah, and
you
there
know,
are a lot of states where there is active legislation. So even if
yeah,
something hasn't been passed yet and it's on both sides of the aisle. So in the
yeah,
states, we've got Republicans and Democrats as the two major parties. There's legislation in both Republican-led states and democratically led states.
yeah.
And there was just an initiative put forward by two members of the federal House of Representatives, one a Republican from, I think, Texas, and one a Democrat from New York, specifically to prioritize this for veterans and treatment of PTSD in veterans. So there is very active, continuing, living legislation happening all the time in the United States.
So are the success rates, how is it measured? I guess, how is it, so they are legalizing it. It's looking very positive over there in the States. I mean, I was listening to a podcast the other day around psychedelics, and the professor David Nutt, sorry. I think he's about the only person, I think, or one of the only people at the moment, sort of like researching psychedelics, and he's very, very supportive of them. In fact, he used to work as a government medical advisor, I think, and I think he got sacked because of his views surrounding them. He did say that the UK is still very, very much behind, unfortunately. So looking to the States, which is quite often what the UK do, looking to the States, what are the, success rates like? And I guess if it has been illegal, how is it measured? How do we know that it is more effective, say, than, an antidepressant or, CBT, for example?
Yeah, so a lot of the research studies are, they've been doing them for several years, and so we're looking to that right now.
Right.
Um, some of them have indicated that for people who are utilizing it for PTSD, OCD, treatment-resistant anxiety, and depression, they usually do 1 to 2 trips, large dose trips, over the course of several weeks. And then they do preparation therapy. They have somebody sitting with them during the experience, and then they do several sessions of integration therapy. The studies that I've seen indicate that with follow-up after a year, people are still symptom-free. So
Wow.
that's pretty huge. People have been able to go off
They don't
antidepressants
need
and not need
anything
to
at
come back
all.
on them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So they're managing their symptoms. um People with OCD being able to say, like, I still have the thoughts, but it doesn't translate to the action,
Yeah.
and it stops making sense as to why I would do that.
Yeah.
So there's been some really, really phenomenal results in terms of long-term efficacy. And again, the studies are still fairly new, the research is still coming out, so we're
Mhm.
going to have to continue doing follow-ups with those patient populations from those research studies, but the indication so far is that it's extraordinarily promising.
And are patients quite willing to try the treatment?
Yeah, and part of why I got into what I do is that I have a lot of people from the community coming to me saying that they want to do this, but they don't want a bad trip. And so,
Yeah, because I was going to say
that's,
there's a bit of a stigma around it, and I think that's one of the reasons why, because people are afraid and
yeah,
say, or they've heard stories about bad trips, and
yep,
you see all kinds of things, and you see monsters, and it's really
yep,
scary. So
yep.
yeah, talk to me a little bit more about that.
That the interest and willingness of people is 100% there, and it's usually the trepidation and the hesitancy of not wanting to have a bad trip that prevents people from doing it.
Is there
And
anything to guarantee that someone wouldn't have a bad trip? No. The
no,
amount,
no,
maybe?
and
Yeah.
no, and the interesting thing about psychedelics is when you take them, part of it is they tend to kind of weasel into the corners of the brain where our fears live and the things that we're
Yeah.
most afraid of.
Yeah.
And if you have, again, with a large dose trip, if you have a trip sitter that can support you through that and let you know that you're safe, one of the things that they found through research is that when you allow that experience to happen, or when you lean into that experience, it becomes less scary.
Hmm.
And having a safe, what we call set and setting, so your mindset going into it and the physical setting that you're in, can help. So if you don't feel good, if you feel like you're starting to have a bad trip, change your lighting, go to a different room,
Mm.
turn music on, turn music off.
Yeah.
Knowing these resources, being able to have these resources when you're doing that, that can help manage a bad trip while you're in it. And then one of the things that they've found with people who come out of it is if they have someone to talk to, again, to
Yeah.
integrate what they've experienced, they recover from that. And many people often say that what was a bad trip became one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives because it allowed them to genuinely confront the things they were most afraid of and
Wow.
come out on the other side. But that, again, was with that support and with that integration. Because if you just have that really bad experience and you don't know what to do with it and you don't know what to make of it
Yeah.
and what that was telling you, the brain works in metaphors. it shows us things that, that's what dreams are. You wake up and you're like, man, I had a really weird dream.
Yeah.
That was your brain talking to you. If you try to break it down, it can be like, oh yeah, this happened yesterday and I had that really bad experience
That's a lovely way
or
to put it, really. When you have a bad dream and then you wake up and you can reflect on it, can't you? And you know that it wasn't real, but it does
yeah.
jolt you.
Yep, yep. If there's the opportunity to attempt to make sense of what your brain was
Uh-huh.
trying to tell you, some clarity can come from that and some learning can come from that. And psychedelics are very similar.
Yeah, fantastic. It's so interesting. It really does. It blows my mind, honestly. So, how long would you have the treatment for? Or does that depend as well?
Again,
And
it
and also,
depends.
how do you decide to microdose or medium dose or museum dose? How do you
Yeah.
decide on those doses and things like that?
So for somebody who's never done psychedelics, we have a phrase called start low and go slow.
Right.
And particularly with burnout, I work with people with burnout.
Yeah.
Our brains have shrunk and our system is in this fight or flight. So the last thing you want to do is shift yourself into high gear
Yeah.
and throw a big change at yourself. So that's how I got into psychedelics. That is how I help other people understand it. So usually I recommend if you've not had any exposure to it, starting with microdosing and having a safe
Yeah.
environment to sort of explore these different doses is a good way to do it. And again,
Yeah.
working with a specialist. I know I sound like a broken record, but having
No, but it's
somebody
being
guide you through
responsible,
that
isn't it? When
process, it's
you're
being
you're not saying
responsible.
go and get some magic mushrooms and you're not saying that at all. You're
Yeah,
saying,
no,
you know,
0 stars, do not recommend.
yeah, exactly. That is highly not recommended, folks. Do not do that at
Highly
home.
not recommended.
It's about
Um,
yeah, sitting with specialists, doing
yeah,
it in those safe environments,
yeah,
having an expert like yourself going through, and also I did read something actually about kind of different types of mushroom. So
yes,
yeah, so
depending
could
on who you
could you
talk
talk to
to,
me a little
some
bit more about that? Because it said some are stronger than others. Yeah.
that I think is highly dependent.
Yeah.
There are some people that say that there's not much of a difference between strains. There are some people that specifically say certain strains are really good for those big mind-blowing experiences, and other strains are really good for like the very mild, kind of like low mini museum type dose experience.
Hmm.
Again, because these things are largely not legalized or decriminalized,
Hmm.
and you don't always know where you're getting them, lower is better because you
Yeah.
don't know what you're getting into.
Start low, go slow.
Start low, go slow.
Did you say? Yeah.
That's always a good recommendation. It's very difficult to
I
go
think we
wrong.
could apply that to
And
most things in
we
life.
can apply that to most things, yes,
Yeah.
which is funny because I have not lived my life like that. I tend to just jump in
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
feet
Yeah.
into the deep
Here's your
end.
friend. I'm
Yeah,
with you.
exactly,
I'm with you,
exactly.
kiddo.
Here's the experience.
Yeah.
Here's $20. Make good choices. That's what I always say is my life motto is here's $20. Make good choices.
Yeah.
Um, but again, starting low, going slow, being
Yeah.
able to do that. And one of the things that I do with my clients in preparation for microdosing before we even start doing something like that is arming you with resources so that whatever comes up, you can manage your state while you're doing it. So I help people understand breathing exercises, yoga nidras. These are the types of things that we utilize so that if you do take a little bit more than you normally would or you normally expected to, and you're like, oh gosh, I don't know what this feels like, go back to your breathing techniques that we've talked about.
Uh-huh.
Utilize these ideas about how to engage with whatever is coming up. Make sure that you're safe, that you have these things that help ground you in
Hmm.
order to do this work. And so a lot of the work that we do in psychedelics is not the physical psychedelic work itself,
Hmm.
but the preparation and the integration. Those are really the bigger parts of utilizing psychedelics. It's the compound. I I hesitate to say that it becomes secondary,
Yeah.
but it really is.
Yeah.
That's not the primary thing that you need when you're utilizing psychedelics.
And is that one of the some of the criteria of them being legalized as well, is that they are used in this situation in this way?
That's really interesting
Yeah.
because that's an interesting space because depending on what you're looking at, certain cultures and certain indigenous populations have been utilizing these things for millennia.
Yeah.
And it's embedded into their culture. And that's something that I was actually reading about just last night.
Yeah, I
We
read that
had
too.
a conference in Denver, and
Uh-huh.
the last day of the conference, there were some some demonstrations, because a lot of the conference is around the science and the medicine and the stuff that we've been talking about. And the indigenous populations who have been utilizing this and who have so much knowledge and so much reverence for these compounds and these biologics, that's been left out of the conversation.
Okay.
And
So what does that
that's been a
mean?
really interesting thing to consider as we move towards legalization and decriminalization, is that these are things, mushrooms grow all over the world,
Yeah. Yeah.
everywhere.
You could
They're
go forage for them yourself,
You
couldn't
can
you?
get
It's
I
one of
would
those.
not
Yeah.
recommend going to
No.
forage for them, because
Yeah, I
ones
probably wouldn't
ones
get them in
that
my
look
back
like you
garden.
could, yeah, no, I mean, and from like knowing
Yeah.
reishi and cordyceps and all of this other stuff,
Yeah.
ones that look like they can go on your salad also can unravel the fabric of reality or poison you. So you need to
Mm,
be careful. I also don't
yeah.
recommend going out and foraging unless you're
Yeah.
very very knowledgeable on that front.
But
But
in certain
but
cultures.
there are certain cultures who
Yeah.
have just cultivated these for years. And so one of the other intersections of this is in the legality of it is, how do we protect those things
Yeah.
for cultures who use them for medicinal or spiritual purposes? That peyote is a big one in the United States.
Peyote.
That's peyote. Yeah, it generally grows in like the southwestern regions, or yeah, southwestern regions of the United States and Mexico and things like that. And it's ingrained in the indigenous cultures there,
Wow.
and it has to grow in a certain way, and it takes time. And so we don't, as colonizers, we don't want to go in and just snap this stuff up, because it can help anybody
Yeah.
deal with their stuff. And so there are a lot of different things that play into, I think, the legalization and simultaneous decolonization
Yeah.
of the medicine. Like, we don't want to colonize it in the process of decriminalizing it. And that's
That's
something that's
interesting
really
what you
not
said,
talked about
actually.
enough.
Where do we get them all from? As you said, you're not just going to go foraging, in the forest. And then,
Yeah.
of course, you don't want to go and upset, you know, these
The
indigenous
ecosystem and the
cultures,
cultural balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, how would you cultivate them yourselves? Is it like, if say, even if the UK legalized them, how would we grow them?
That's one of the things that we're confronting in the United States with the cannabis legalization right now, is how to
Right.
go about that.
Yeah.
So chances are there would be initiatives for people to, or companies to be able to grow them.
Yeah.
One of the things in some of the legal language, I think in the Rhode Island bill, was to be able to cultivate it yourself for
Mm-hmm.
personal use in your own home. So people would be able to do that. And there are people that do that now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you
Growing
know,
them themselves at home.
growing them themselves. I'm just like, I don't know, I can't
Is it that
again,
easy
I
to do?
I
Is it?
can't recommend it.
No, I know.
But but
This
there are
podcast
people
comes
that
with a
do it.
warning, folks.
Yeah,
But yeah, is it,
exactly.
so yeah, well, cannabis you can grow at home, can't you?
Yeah, yeah.
And
So it's kind of it's
yeah,
still a grow at
it's
your
all
own risk.
natural. It's food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in the United States, again, like I think Massachusetts and I want to say Rhode Island adopted the same. You can have up to 6 plants. So like three mature plants and like three that are in process, because again, that takes its time to grow as well.
Okay.
So I believe that in many places they're trying to build in language where if people wanted to, they would be able to grow it themselves, or there would be dispensaries like there are with cannabis dispensaries. There would be psilocybin dispensaries
Hmm.
that grow and manufacture and prepare and process these things for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these are also compounds that can be manufactured from a more pharmaceutical perspective.
Yeah.
And like that's something that LSD is. LSD is manufactured chemically, and psilocybin has been oh God, I'm losing the word right now. Synthesized.
Yeah.
So that can be chemically synthesized as well. It doesn't necessarily have to
So
be grown in mushroom form.
can LSD, MDMA, can that be used in the same way?
From a research perspective, I believe it has been.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Um, from a treatment perspective, they are different compounds, and
Right.
so they
Okay.
do different things.
Yeah.
I know some of the research into MDMA has been looked at from the perspective of it doesn't end up with the same kind of visual hallucinations necessarily.
Yeah.
But there is a detachment from the self, from the ego, that allows observation and engagement with more difficult feelings
Yeah.
without experiencing them quite so intensely. So I think there's value in each of them, but it's kind of figuring out what they do and where they fit and
Yeah.
which people they'd be a good match for, because some
Mhm.
people would probably do really well on MDMA who would not do well on mushrooms or LSD. I have
Right.
zero interest in LSD.
Yeah.
That from my I've never taken it, and from my
No.
understanding, it's a much more intense experience. I
Yeah.
also don't have any interest in DMT, which
Yeah.
is
What's that
the
one?
active compound in ayahuasca. And that, in very small amounts, I think people tend to smoke it. And
Okay.
it is a
I've
very
never heard of
short
it.
trip.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very short trip, but it's a very intense trip.
Yeah.
I don't have interest
That's
in
not
that.
what you're about.
That's
No.
not what I'm here for.
No.
You know, other people who are interested in psychedelics or who do them regularly, often referred to as psychonauts. You know, there are people who specifically go for those experiences. I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's not me. Thanks. Keep it.
Yeah. I think they're very much considered, especially here in the UK, the clubber's drug. You know, mushrooms, I think, have a much more, I'd say, acceptance of use. You know, because yeah, they're a natural kind of
They're
compound. You
natural.
know,
they grow
and
all
they've
over
been
the
used for
place.
centuries. Yeah, you
Yes.
know, and
Yes.
they've had the kind of those powers there, really.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
um, this might sound like a really stupid question, Eliza, but why are some mushrooms? You know, why can I have some in my stir fry, and why are some gonna make me hallucinate? Is it? I know, is that a stupid question?
It's
I
not a
just
stupid
want to ask
question.
it.
It's variety. Why are some peppers really mild? Why are bell peppers really mild and
Okay,
ghost peppers gonna melt your face off? It's just different chemistry,
just different chemistry.
you know?
No real reason for it.
No,
Yeah.
it's just how they evolved, and it's how our chemistry evolved alongside them.
Yeah.
So, you know, bell peppers are nutritious and
Yeah.
give me lots of good nutrients and minerals. And psilocybin mushrooms, the psilocybin compound looks like serotonin, which we think of as a happy chemical.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
it's very active in our gut. Actually, I think 80% of our serotonin is manufactured in our intestines, but it's been related to mood for a very long time. So when
Mhm.
we take psilocybin mushrooms, it breaks down into a compound called psilocin in our system,
Okay.
and that goes out and it finds our serotonin receptors, and it binds to our serotonin receptors the way that serotonin would. And so that's why we have those kind of euphoric experiences. And that's also why people who are on something like a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, an antidepressant,
Uh-huh.
certain classes of antidepressants should not be combined with these compounds, because you can
I
end up
heard
with what's
that.
called serotonin
Yeah.
overload or serotonin toxicity. So if you are on medications, depending on, you know, what's going on, you want to be very, very careful. We
This is
think
not
of,
advised. Yeah.
yeah, we think of like, oh, it's a mushroom, it's a natural compound. We think of supplements the same way.
Uh-huh.
They impact our system, they affect our system, and depending on what else we're putting in our system, those things can have very strong interactions.
Mm. Well, you just said it there, didn't you? Like if you have a supplement, but you have too many of them, say, or you mix it with something else, or,
Yeah,
then
yeah,
you're
you
going to
know,
create problems for yourself.
we hear about, I mean, you can go into any grocery store here and find licorice
Mm.
root, you know, and that is a Chinese herb, gansao. I use it
Mm-hmm.
in my acupuncture practice and my
Mm-hmm.
herbal practice with clients, but it in higher doses can raise blood pressure. So if you
Yeah.
have high blood pressure or you're on blood pressure medication, you don't want to take licorice necessarily, and you certainly don't want to take it in high doses. And that's something you can get at Whole Foods here. Not
Yeah.
demonizing Whole Foods, but
Amazing.
being very mindful of what you're taking. You know, the same thing goes with psychedelics or anything else that you're putting into your system. You need to know the overall picture of what it's going to do.
So you said there that that's that's not a good mix. Who else is it not good for? Who else would you not advise to take the psychedelics?
I would not advise anybody in active crisis to do it. So if like
Right.
you're really struggling with your anxiety in a moment and you're like, I'm gonna take a psychedelic and I'm just gonna deal with this,
That's not going to
don't.
work.
That's
No.
that's not a great time to do it, because again, the mindset isn't there
Okay.
for it. And we, to my knowledge, we don't have research on people with things like bipolar or a
Okay.
history of psychosis or a family history of psychosis. So if you are prone to psychotic episodes, psychotic breaks, if you have something like dissociative identity disorder, we don't have enough research there to know what that's going to do. So if you have something like that and you are interested in doing that, I recommend speaking to your primary care physician and getting a referral to somebody who is a psychedelic assisted therapist for something like that. Because
Right.
again, we don't know. It it may help those conditions. We don't know. And
Yeah.
so when we don't have that kind of information, it's better to sort of stay away from it
Yeah.
until you can connect with somebody who knows more about that.
I see. And if somebody comes to you and they're looking to use psychedelics, is there a kind of a thorough assessment beforehand to ensure that, this person is, the right fit or, is going to benefit from the treatment?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I do a very thorough intake with my clients
Hmm.
because, and I do this with all of my clients, not just my psychedelic clients,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, when you are looking to work with somebody, you want to make sure that the provider is a good fit for you. And I, as a provider, want to make sure that the client is a good fit for me.
Yeah.
Because if I cannot provide them the best value or the safest value in any circumstance, I'm not the person to work with them. And I am
Yeah.
happy to refer them to other people in my network that are a better fit for them. So,
Yeah.
yeah, all of my assessments, whether it's burnout recovery, psychedelics, acupuncture, I do a very thorough intake with people to make sure
And
that
it's the
I'm the
same
person that they
here.
need to be with. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Therapy is as well,
And
definitely.
obviously you would make referrals if that person wasn't going to, yeah, be a
Yep,
good
I
fit
have a
for
really
each
big
other.
network and I've actually already I've had people come to me interested in psychedelic work, and when I ask them what they're looking to do, the psychedelic work that is legalized right now in at least Rhode Island and I think the US is ketamine therapy.
Yeah, I've heard a
And
little bit about that.
yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's it's kind of in that class of things where that can be helpful. And we have doctors and nurse practitioners trained in that in the United States. And I know one here in Rhode Island. So I've referred people to her because they'll come to me and they'll say, "This is what I'm dealing with. This is my background. This is my history." Okay, I'm not your person. You're not dealing with
So
burnout and
why would they
day-to-day stress
have
and
ketamine
anxiety.
therapy and not psychedelic, not mushroom therapy, psychedelic therapy?
It's researched, it's legalized differently. It went through a different process.
I see.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And ketamine is specific to medical treatment, whereas with the legalization and decriminalization of things like cannabis and mushrooms, there is a recreational
Recreational
element to some
side.
of that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are places where psilocybin and mushrooms have been legalized or decriminalized for medical use,
Hmm.
but not recreational use. And so it is just it's such a new landscape from a legal perspective that we're kind of crossing the bridge as we build it, so to speak.
Hmm. Hmm. So, I know on this other podcast that I was listening to, they were saying that a lot of the decisions that are made by the government, etc., are just very political. There is a lack of understanding of the medical field. Um, I guess, would you agree is the same in the US?
Oh.
Oh.
I think it depends on who you talk to. I think that
Yeah.
there are politicians and people in the political landscape who are very invested in understanding this. But I also think that there can be a disconnect between research and practical execution.
Yeah. I agree.
From a Chinese medicine perspective, I don't use ice on injuries. I will use cooler herbs and cooler compounds to reduce swelling, but I won't use ice. And the guy who originally came up with the rest ice compression elevation, the rice mnemonic in the
Mhm.
70s, has the man who developed that rolled back his feelings on using ice because it doesn't actually help and it can cause problems later on.
Mhm.
That is still one of the most common things
I do it
in
myself. I say
modern
it to my
medicine. A
son,
hundred
yeah,
percent.
let's get some
A
ice on
hundred
that.
percent.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. That it is so ingrained in our culture
Yeah.
because it hasn't permeated that yet. And
Wow.
so, from a
I
political
never knew that.
perspective, one of the nice things to see with the psychedelic renaissance, I say renaissance, psychedelics have been around for millennia with other cultures again.
Yeah.
Um, but the sort of modern biomedical interest in it is that it does seem to be bipartisan in the United States, whether it's Republican or Democrat, there does seem to be overall support for movement forward in some direction. It's, I think, one of the handful of places where the two parties are agreeing right now, which is
Yeah.
weird and delightful. Um,
No,
but
I
yeah,
don't know too much about the US politics. I don't really know too much about the UK ones, to be honest. But yeah, at least there is that. I think um, that that forward thinking there.
yes,
You know,
very, very much so, very much
yeah,
so. And I think a lot of that in many ways comes from the benefits that we're seeing with veterans because
yeah,
in my acupuncture practice, I've worked with veterans for 10 years as an independent contractor of the VA.
right.
And so I don't work for the Veterans Affairs Association, but I do work with them alongside them. And it has been such a historically difficult population to treat because of the incredibly challenging and sometimes horrific things that they experience and
Absolutely.
then come back and have to deal with. And so psychedelics have been a real balm for many of the individuals who have been living day to day with the absolute horror of coming back from war. And um, I, I think both sides of the political aisle are committed to making sure that that population has better treatment because we have failed them as a country for so long.
Mm, yeah, I'd say the same here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just before we finish up, we're coming near to the end, Eliza. Um, can you tell me a little bit more about the Fireside Project?
Yeah, the Fireside Project is
Yeah. Oh,
amazing.
you
So
see, you got excited
it's so
then. Yeah.
exciting. Yeah, I love them. So the Fireside Project is an organization here in the United States, and they are a call line. They're a helpline.
Okay.
And for people who have taken a psychedelic and are feeling like they need support, they can call this number, and it is staffed by volunteers who are trained to support people through a psychedelic trip. And you
Okay.
don't need to be on a huge dose psychedelic to be able to
Uh-huh.
do this. If you take a small dose and you just find that some emotions are coming up, or you just want to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
So they staff the line from, I think, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time
Yeah.
in United States time zone. And it's just a really amazing, supportive place for people to get the support that they need in that moment. And I actually read something, I think, directly on their Instagram recently
Uh-huh.
that they've had people call in afterwards to do integration work. So even if they're not still in the middle of a psychedelic trip, they can call after and say, "Hey, I did this, so, however many days or weeks ago, and I just want to talk to somebody about it."
Yeah.
And so it creates that space for support and integration, completely free, staffed by individuals who want to be there. It's a really amazing organization, and I'm
Marvelous.
so thrilled that they exist. And I'm really hoping that we can see more support for them as an organization, see more people sign up as volunteers, and see other companies and organizations around the world um,
Follow suit.
follow that example and
Yeah.
follow suit and create this kind of environment because that type of support and integration is what we need.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, um, just to finish, what to you does the future of psychedelics look like?
Oh man,
Is that a biggie?
it's a biggie because
Yeah.
it's so unknown right now. There are so many moving parts to it.
Yeah.
Um, I think what I would like to see, I can speak to the type of future that I would like to see for psychedelics.
Absolutely. Go on.
I would really love to see a more conscious effort to embrace and honor the indigenous cultures who have been using this and to make an effort to understand their knowledge and practices, and again reverence for it, because I think that's
Mhm.
something that in the medicalization of it we have lost the
Mm.
reverence and the respect for this. Like these are living,
I
breathing
agree.
compounds that
Yeah.
grow and deserve respect and honor. And so when I have utilized them in the past, I don't have like a big, like I don't go out into the woods and you know pray with incense,
Mm.
but I thank what I'm taking into my body for the work that it's doing. Something as simple as gratitude for it. I would like to see more of a movement in that direction
Yeah.
because we're recognizing the clinical effectiveness of it. And I think divorcing it from the respect that it deserves is a disservice to the medicine and a disrespect to the cultures that have been using it. So that's a big piece of what I would like to see.
And we have seen that in
And
history, haven't we? Where
oh yes,
the Westerners have
yep.
kind of come in and stomped in and said, okay,
The
we found that this works, and yeah, upset cultures.
Yep, absolutely. So a big movement in that direction.
Mhm.
And then I think just a broader acceptance and understanding of overall education and
Yeah.
support. Again,
I
the
think education
medicalization
is
of
a
this,
biggie,
there's
isn't it?
yeah, there
You know,
and that's why I do what I do.
yeah,
That's why I'm literally here on this podcast today. Is like
yeah,
education is a huge piece of that for people because I think there's a lot of opinions right now again about the medicalization of this and the gatekeeping of it. And are we going to do that, or are we going to give people access to this and
and
help
still
them
a
do it as
stigma
safely as
surrounding it. A
possible?
kind of a
Yeah.
stereotype still based on kind of. As I said, going to Amsterdam and get magic mushrooms, or
Yeah, yeah.
going clubbing, and things like that. So
Yeah.
it's demystifying the
It's
ideas around it.
demystifying. Yeah, it's demystifying, it's providing education, and it's providing harm reduction in
Yeah.
whatever that looks like. If that means safe spaces for people to come and do this,
Hmm.
with the support of individuals who work there,
Yeah.
if it means helping people understand what growing and preparing and microdosing means, like there's a lot of potential.
Yeah.
We're in a space of a lot of potential right now, which I'm very excited about, but I think that it needs to be done intentionally and from a place of inclusion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also the fact that, perhaps you said it before, we need to move on, we need to progress. We've been perhaps using the same medical treatments now for decades, and perhaps it's only got worse. And even maybe probably from COVID as well, it's only gonna, you know, the aftermath is still gonna spiral. And certain medications and certain therapies aren't don't seem to be working anymore, certainly for
Yeah,
some groups of people.
or they work for some people and they don't work for
Yeah,
others. And we're
exactly.
really
Yeah,
anytime we can
we
expand
need
the
another
opportunity to find
alternative.
more. Yeah.
Yeah, another alternative. Well, Eliza, I have taken up far too much of your time already.
Not
Uh,
at all. It was a
but
pleasure.
just such a powerful conversation, and perhaps hopefully you'll come back sometime in the future, maybe perhaps where there's been some advancement, and we can talk even more about that, because that would just be wonderful. And we'll have to keep an eye on the UK. I'm
Yes.
not sure whether they're quite behind, and from my own readings and listening to different podcasts as well. But please do keep in touch, and wish you every success. And thank you very much for being here today, all the way from Rhode Island. And good luck with everything that you're doing, because you're doing an amazing job.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eliza. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for watching Bouncing Back Stronger. If you scan the QR code that you can see on the screen, then you can contact me via any of my social platforms. When you do, if you want to say hi, that's great. I'll be glad to say hi back. But also, if you have a story you'd like to share, or if you would like to come on the show, maybe as a guest with a story, or as a guest who can offer some strategies or tools to help others move from where they are to where they want to be. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.